Hey guys, welcome back. Obviously, things have changed a little bit over here. I am in an entirely new setting, an entirely new location in the United States, and if you haven't been following along on my channel, and this is the first time you found me, you can go and look. I have on my channel an entire playlist called The Trailer Chapters that will take you through what has landed us in this situation that we are now in and the adventure and everything that has ensued. But that is not what we're going to be talking about today. Today we are going to be returning to the topic of Opus Dei, a deep dive that I began a month or so ago and have been itching to get back to. I have not forgotten about it. I've had the outline for this video made up for quite some time, and I am very serious about continuing down this path of digging into Opus Dei as much as we possibly can and discussing why this organization is just so problematic. If you missed the first video that I made about Opus Dei, I highly recommend that you go back and watch it because it will give you a bit of an overview about what Opus Dei is, where they were founded, by whom they were founded, and some of the very problematic and glaring issues with the organization, and why I think it's so important that people be aware of and talk about what is going on with this organization. Today we're going to be looking at some of the first-hand accounts from people who were within the organization for quite some time, who came out and spoke out about what they experienced. I think these first-hand accounts give us a bird's eye view into what it is like inside Opus Dei, and so I really want to spend some time reading through these stories with you guys and reacting to them and hopefully sparking some kind of conversation. The source that I am using for these stories is a website called ODAN, which stands for the Opus Dei Awareness Network. It is made up of detractors from Opus Dei, people who have come out from the other side and are speaking out about what they've experienced, trying to create a community and find healing through speaking out about Opus Dei. Before we go through these stories, I've picked out 3 different stories for us to react to. I want to read through a little blurb that ODAN has on their website. It's an ODAN statement about the Da Vinci Code. And if you remember in my first video, I said that Opus Dei used the movie The Da Vinci Code to kind of springboard their mission to proselytize and make themselves look really good. They used the dramatization of Opus Dei in the Da Vinci Code to really get themselves out there, and they used that to their advantage. This brings up some good points that I want to make sure I make sooner rather than later, so we're going to read through this first. For those of us who have witnessed firsthand Opus Dei's deceptive and manipulative practices, it has not been easy watching Opus Dei stage a large public relations campaign in order to dispel the image the book The Da Vinci Code has projected about them. It is equally hard to watch Opus Dei not be honest about their questionable practices. An inaccurate explanation of what exists within Opus Dei is being projected through their public statements and media appearances. The timing of their response to the movie appears highly choreographed and feels more like a high-powered Madison Avenue public relations firm is behind all the activity rather than a disorganized organization, as Opus Dei has recently portrayed itself. And that is something that I want to get into in some future video, is Opus Dei's headquarters in New York City, a lot of the money inside the organization, where all of that leads. I think it's absolutely fascinating, so stay tuned for that. Recently, high-ranking Opus Dei men, no women, convened in Rome in order to draft a campaign they call Operation Lemonade, which has got to be like one of the most sinister things I think I've ever heard. A lighthearted name that masks the controlled environment that exists within the group. The name does not lend itself to the reality of what Opus Dei truly practices: deceptive recruitment and manipulative control of its membership. Operation Lemonade produced 3 goals. 1. Turn publicity into an opportunity to proselytize. 2. Ally itself with other Catholics, essentially hide behind the church. And this is key, I want to make sure, we're going to come back to it. 3. Maintain a non-aggressive tone. In recent weeks, Opus Dei has tried to equate criticism of its organization with criticism of the Catholic Church. An example of how Opus Dei piggybacks itself with the Catholic Church is demonstrated in the statement, according to Brian Finnerty, U.S. Media Relations Director for the Catholic group Opus Dei, the novel, The Da Vinci Code, is a completely inaccurate portrayal of the Catholic Church. Does that include Opus Dei? To the casual observer, Opus Dei could be taken as the Catholic Church. This is huge. I cannot emphasize this enough. They have done this on purpose. Opus Dei has purposefully elevated themselves and equated themselves with the Catholic Church so that you cannot say anything negative about Opus Dei without it being spun into you saying something negative about the Catholic Church. I have my own opinions about the Catholic Church. However, this is not the time or place to speak about them. We are purely talking about Opus Dei, which is an organization within the Catholic Church, and I do believe that there is some responsibility of Rome for what Opus Dei has done. But you need to keep that in mind as we are going forward, especially if you, the viewer, are a Catholic yourself, devout, and you love the Catholic Church and that's your whole thing. Be very aware of that. Because if Opus Dei succeeds in its mission to try to equate criticism of its organization with criticism of the Catholic Church, breaking them apart and holding them accountable for the things that they have done will be nearly impossible. We need to be able to have an intelligent, rational conversation about Opus Dei singularly as an organization, separate from the Catholic Church. We have to be able to do that because they are something completely aside from the Catholic Church. They may be affiliated with it, but they are their own animal. You have to be able to critique that. That is huge. That is so, so huge. Continuing, Odan does not agree with the Da Vinci Code's depiction of Christianity and does not question the divinity of Christ. However, where the Da Vinci Code is accurate is in its depiction of the blind obedience of the fictional Opus Dei character Silas, the albino monk. His behavior demonstrates the absolute control and obedience that exists in Opus Dei today. Former members have contacted Odan with stories of pressure exerted by Opus Dei in a culture that demands obedience in every situation. We'll get into some of those. Former members testify that they have been forced by Opus Dei directors to hand over their salaries, abandon past friendships, ignore dubious financial irregularities, turn over their mail to be read without the sender's knowledge, aggressively recruit, prepare monthly statistical reports about potential members, and even not attend siblings' weddings, which frankly, in light of everything else, is the least of the issues. If they did not go along with what Opus Dei requested of them, in some cases dishonest acts, they were told they risked eternal damnation and some were eventually asked to leave. So that's mental and emotional manipulation. Members who question Opus Dei's practices are reprimanded and often led to the following quote from Opus Dei's founder, quote, "If one of my children abandons the fight or leaves the war or turns his back, let him know that he betrays us all, Jesus Christ, the Church, his brothers and sisters, and the work. It would be treason to consent to the tiniest act of unfaithfulness in these moments." Another source for information about the Da Vinci Code is The Real History Behind the Da Vinci Code by medieval scholar and historian Sharon Newman. Written in encyclopedic form alphabetically, there is a section on Opus Dei and Odan. She reveals historical truths and myths in her book. In the previews of the Da Vinci Code movie, the use of corporal mortification, specifically the discipline, whip, and the sillis, spiked chain, are depicted as violent, bloody acts. The sound magnifies their impact. This is a sensationalist image, and Opus Dei members mostly do not bring this practice to such heights, nor does the average Opus Dei member's life resemble Silas's. This horrible depiction has given Opus Dei the opportunity to focus on the extremes of the movie and mask the real problems within Opus Dei, which is what I said before. A supernumerary member of Opus Dei recently appeared on a TV program and was asked to give her explanation of the use of corporal mortification within Opus Dei. When asked to comment about the use of the discipline, she said, quote, "A few people in Opus Dei just mildly slap at their back while reciting prayers." End quote. Opus Dei numeraries do not slap their backs with the discipline, they hit their buttocks, and describing it as a slap is an attempt to soften the intensity of using it. Continuing, she says, quote, "Only a few people in Opus Dei use corporal mortification," end quote. Not one former numerary member has told Odan in its 14 years of existence that they are not compelled to use the sillis and discipline. As a supernumerary member of Opus Dei, she does not have accurate information about what a numerary member's life consists of. So that's something I hope I can kind of explain a little bit clearer later on down the line. Within Opus Dei, there are basically ranks, and people are organized in these ranks, and depending on which rank you fall into depends on the quality of life that you have, basically. That an Opus Dei nearly always puts forth supernumerary members for media interviews, and it is in itself a deception. It is yet another example of Opus Dei secrecy and the ways it keeps the general public and even a portion of its members uninformed to what the other part is doing. On March 22nd, 2006, Opus Dei launched a revamped website in 22 languages. On April 16th, 2006, it issued a statement through most of their websites requesting a disclaimer on the upcoming film. In an April 6th, 2006 letter to Sony Corporation, Opus Dei wrote, quote, "Any such decision by Sony would be a gesture of respect toward the figure of Jesus, to the history of the church, and to the religious beliefs of its viewers," end quote. And here again, they're equating the things that they do and the behavior of their members with the Catholic Church as a whole, so that you cannot extricate your opinion about Opus Dei from your opinion of the Catholic Church as a whole, which is majorly problematic. The timing has allowed Opus Dei to be the driving force on media coverage prior to the film's release and mixes criticism of Opus Dei with the Catholic Church. For the general public not familiar with Opus Dei, it would seem that individuals who criticize Opus Dei would also be criticizing the Catholic Church, which is simply not true. In almost 15 years in existence, ODAN has never seen any significant sign that Opus Dei is open to honest criticism or willing to change harmful practices. In fact, the founder himself wrote the following quote, "As Jesus received his doctrine from the Father, so my doctrine is not mine, but comes from God, and so not a jot or tittle shall ever be changed," end quote. And if you saw my first video, you recall that the founder, Jose Maria Escriva, had this vision from God, he claimed, where he saw Opus Dei as a way for people to lead a holier life as Catholics, blah, 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 blah. You can go and watch it there. That's where that comes from. He's basically saying, Jesus did this thing, I'm doing this thing, we're the same, don't criticize us. To further demonstrate the depth and scope of criticism of Opus Dei, ODAN has received 2 separate letters from anonymous parents whose children attend several different Opus Dei schools. We will be reading one of those later on. In John Allen's book about Opus Dei, he states, quote, "Think of it, Opus Dei, as the Guinness Extra Stout of the Catholic Church. It's a strong brew, definitely an acquired taste and clearly not for everyone," end quote. Yes, Opus Dei may seem to be a stout beer, but think of this possibility. It has purposefully changed the label on its drink to something else, all while keeping its true contents secret. Jesus did not lie, nor was he secretive about his ministry while he walked on earth. In John 18:20, Jesus answers his critics, quote, "I have spoken openly to the world, I have said nothing in secret." His ministry was out in the open for all to see. When can we say the same about Opus Dei? I just wanted to read through that because it pointed out some really important points that I wanted to make sure were made sooner rather than later, especially the whole Opus Dei Catholic Church equivalency issue, which I think is huge. So now for these stories, there are 3, like I said. One of them is a letter, one of the letters mentioned earlier, and the other 2 are stories written in by people who came out of Opus Dei. So I'll read the letter first. There are parts of this letter that were redacted to protect the identities of the people being discussed, so bear that in mind. It gets a little crazy at certain points with all the redacted information, but hopefully you can still understand the gist of what they're writing. So they wrote this to the founder of ODAN. "Dear Miss Di Nicola, we are writing to you and hope that your organization may be able to help. Or information coming from an organization is far more powerful and cannot be silenced as easily as an individual. Our daughters go to redacted. When they began, we thought we were sending them to an all-girls Catholic school. Many people, including Catholics, have never heard of Opus Dei. And like I said in my first video, Opus Dei has managed to get their fingers into a whole lot of pies, and they are very, very involved in education and formation of young people. That is like a big deal for them, because that's where they draw a lot of their recruitment. When we questioned this, after learning about their affiliation, they claimed they were not an Opus Dei school. After learning more about them and their deceitful tactics, we realized they make this claim on technicalities. For example, they say Redacted School is not funded by Opus Dei, yet if you dig a bit further, Redacted Foundation Incorporated is a holding of Opus Dei and has the same address. The heads of school have always been Opus Dei. The board of trustees is comprised of Opus Dei members or cooperators. Most teachers and administration belong to the organization, and most activities are Opus Dei related, which they don't announce: apple picking, retreats, camps, guest speakers, etc. Even awards received by the school are Opus Dei sponsored. Never do they indicate the Opus Dei connection in any of this. Yet all of these awards and community/family events helps to give the perception of a perfect school, a perfect place to send your daughter. No one is aware of the pressure, stress, and manipulation that will become a part of her life while someone tries to recruit her into their world. We could go on and on, however, we're sure you understand because you're familiar with the way they work. It is very deceitful and subtle. And I just want to circle back to where they are talking about how everything is painted to give you this perception of this perfect school and this perfect environment and everyone's so great. Sounds a lot to me like love bombing, which is a technique that cults will use to draw people in and get them comfortable and susceptible to whatever influence that cult is trying to enforce over the individual. Just some food for thought. They have an advising program which does nothing to help the girls with day-to-day school issues. It is totally centered around proselytizing, although no one knows this. girls are asked about other girls and encouraged to tell about others' wrongdoings, the advisors befriend the girls and the families if they can, sometimes just to get their money. As you can imagine, if the girl does not conform, then she is pushed in the background, considered a nothing. Opus Dei girls, or the ones they feel are candidates, get the good grades, get parts in plays, get into the better colleges, get to play in the sports teams, etc., etc., etc. They truly humiliate and degrade girls who are not willing to become one of them. The school tells them they don't have school spirit, or they are not demonstrating good character. They try to take away their self-esteem and then tell them they are the only ones who can help them, which is classic. Make someone feel helpless, make someone feel like they are worthless, and then make them believe that you are the only person who can help them, the only one who can show them the way out. That is just classic abusive manipulation. All of this is done so professionally. The staff and teachers are extremely nice to the parents who question any of these happenings. They are assured that their daughter is wonderful and a pleasure and that she must have misunderstood. Favorite phrases to parents are, "Your daughter works so hard. Parents are the primary educators. We will do whatever you would like." And our favorite, "She is the only one experiencing this. We haven't heard this from anyone else." So they're alienating anyone who dares to speak out. This makes people keep issues to themselves rather than talk about them. However, recently more and more parents have been talking to each other and realizing that many non-Opus Dei families are experiencing the same behavior from the school. There is no doubt in our minds that girls not willing to buy into the system are treated poorly. To attend one of their open houses is a great experience. One would think the school was wonderful. They talk about character and vision, morals and ethics and family. What one does not realize is that family means the Opus Dei family. Your life becomes theirs when you attend this school. It affects your whole family. They completely take over the girls' free time. Hours of weekend homework are given, along with being expected to help on the weekend with school-related activities. They plan your daughter's every move. The stress becomes almost unbearable for girls to be perfect, to do everything extraordinarily well. They talk about service, but no one knows they mean service to Opus Dei. Most community service projects are conducted by non-Opus Dei students, so the school can say they are involved. However, rarely is an Opus Dei girl involved. And look, here's the thing. If this school was being upfront about who they are and what their mission was and what they were trying to do, they were honest about the pressures that were going to be placed on these girls, okay, fine. If that is what your kid wants, if that's what you want for them, if that's what you want to put them through, have at it. That's your cup of tea. Have a ball. But they hide behind the facade of being something that they aren't. And then all of this other stuff comes to the surface relatively quickly. It just reeks of something sinister. It gives me a very bad taste in my mouth. It does not seem genuine. It is amazing how much control they obtain over the girls. Their brainwashing techniques have been perfected. Girls begin to feel superior to others morally. They become harsh and judgmental to others not like them. They are taught that other faiths and opinions are unacceptable. If they do not buy into these beliefs, they are chastised and ostracized. They are humiliated, degraded, and made to feel inadequate. The idea, be like us or your life will be miserable. Redacted School has bought property in Redacted in order to build a new school. People in the community are unsuspecting. Our goal is to try to make people aware of this group before they get involved with the school. Everything is so subtle and deceitful that people don't realize until it is too late that they have made a very bad choice for their daughters. People should know up front what they are. That's what I'm saying. Our girls are aware of mortification practices. They know about teachers using a sillis and small whip. Many times the girls are told to give something up that would by many seem harsh. For example, no heat on some retreats and no heat in the school on days that were 35 degrees. They were not allowed to wear sweatshirts, even school uniform ones, if they were cold. They must take pants off that they wear under their uniform to walk from the train on cold days before they enter the school building or they get a detention. They have been told these forms of mortification, along with many others, are okay because Christ suffered for us. None of this is healthy for young girls to be exposed to. The attrition rate is huge. Many parents do not like what is going on and leave, but do not really talk about it. They are afraid. Some cannot leave. They realize too late what is happening. Some students have been frightened into staying. The advisor and admission director and head have told girls that it is too hard to leave. They will not have any friends or the academics are not as good at another school. They find a student's vulnerable point. Some students have been misrepresented on teacher recommendations. Student recommendations are known to have been very negative, so the student will be rejected by other schools. The senior classes have been extremely small. Many are Opus Dei families, but others are those who could not get out and their lives have been filled with torment and hurt. If someone digs hard enough, we're sure they would get parents who would talk about their experiences. However, many are afraid. We could write many pages on the secretive ways of deceit, brainwashing, and recruitment of young girls, but we know you have seen it all. It is so good to know someone who will believe us and sympathize in our horrific experience. And then they say that if you have any contacts that would help people in the area, bring awareness, we hope that they will not be able to get enough girls to attend the new school. We are afraid for our girls, so we must remain anonymous. They are at the mercy of the redacted faculty and administration. Hopefully our daughters will get out unharmed. Just imagine what it would be like to be in a situation like that. As a young person, when you are having your opinion and viewpoint of the world formed, being sent to this school that you are being told is such a great school and is going to set you up for success, and then finding all these strings attached. Children are so vulnerable to attack, to this kind of manipulation and frankly abuse. The kind of harm that is going to create in someone long term, it's going to require years and years and years of therapy to be able to work through and recover from something like that. And parents are afraid to speak out against these schools and about Opus Dei, and they've lost control of their families. This next story, Deception and Drugs and Opus Dei, it's a real kicker. It's by Maria, a former numerary from Venezuela. So this is a story from outside of the United States. It says, "Dear young man or woman who attends an Opus Dei center, as a former numerary of Opus Dei, I accepted the opportunity to tell you a little of my experience in the work for almost 5 years. I am originally from Venezuela and joined the work at age 20. I left Opus Dei right before my 25th birthday. Today I am happily married and blessed with 4 wonderful children. I will try to be brief, even though it would take a book to express what one has lived and gone through while in this institution. I was young with great goals in life and a desire to change the world and bring Christ to all human beings. I first came in contact with Opus Dei when I met a numerary at the university where I was studying education. She invited me to her center for a free conference on the career of an educator. I found out later she had planned this conference especially for me, since I seemed to her like a good candidate for their work from the very beginning. At the conference, I met other people who were also in the field of education, most of whom were members of the work, of course. This numerary didn't tell me at the time anything about Opus Dei. The following week, I was invited to go hiking with some of the girls that lived in the center. I didn't realize then that this was part of their recruitment technique. Later, as we became better friends, she started telling me more about Opus Dei and the founder and invited me to my first meditation on a Saturday morning. Everything that I'm reading is just screaming cult, 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 just because the secrecy about the identity of the organization, their unwillingness to divulge the fact that they're members of Opus Dei, the very deliberated, targeted recruitment of people that they believe are candidates for this organization. This isn't like a fraternity or a sorority or something. This is something totally different. This is how they operate. If you consent to their friendly invitation, they will evaluate you and ask you many questions to see if you are a good prospect for them. Please beware when you enter a center for the first time. You will meet happy people with big smiles in a casual atmosphere. Love bombing. They will show concern and care for you, the new visitor, make your visit very pleasant, too pleasant at times. As time went on, I started visiting the center more frequently and spending more time with my new Opus Dei friends. About a year after my first encounter with that numerary, I found myself asking to be admitted into Opus Dei as a numerary or full-time member. As soon as I whistled or joined the work, my director instructed me to not tell my parents I had joined Opus Dei. When I disobeyed and told my mother, I was reprimanded. Why the need for the secrecy? I'm just wondering. Why not just be upfront about the fact that you're a member of this organization? If this organization is so great and living up to everything that Jose Maria Escriva envisioned, why not just be honest about that? Just reminds me of the saying, secrets don't make friends. You know? Not long after that, I began to find out more things about the life of a numerary, such as all the corporal mortifications. We were required to wear a silas or spiked chain tied around our upper thigh for 2 hours a day, except on Opus Dei or church feast days. I also found out about the discipline, which is a small whip used on the naked buttocks once a week, among other sacrifices we were required to make as part of our vocation. I was also informed that we mostly spent time with those friends who may have a vocation to the work. I also learned that the work was now my family, with stronger bonds than my blood family, and that I would never again be allowed to spend the night at my parents' home. There were other things I found out when I moved into the center. I was happy at the very beginning of my vocation, but not for long. I soon began to see many inconsistencies in my life as a numerary. numerary. The way we were required to pursue people to join the work started to seem manipulative and deceptive. I remember clearly an incident that happened, which was probably one of the first red flags that made me start questioning the false friendships we were required to pursue in the work in order to get girls to join as numerary members. I had a friend, Carolina, whom I had invited to the UNIV conference in Rome, since she had been on my St. Joseph list as someone who, according to the directors of my center at the time, had a vocation to become a numerary. So they're deciding that people have vocations, quote unquote, to join their organization. It's not these people who are feeling called necessarily. It's the directors and the members of this organization who are making that decision for you. They're saying, oh, we see something in you that you can't see. You have great promise. We're going to bring it out of you. This is your vocation. This is what you're called to do. This is what God wants. This is what God wants you to do, so you need to do it. She ended up whistling in Rome as the directors had planned. As soon as she wrote the letter to be admitted as a numerary, the directors immediately told me that she should no longer talk to me as a friend or share anything personal with me, since she was now a numerary. They told me there wasn't any kind of special friendships allowed in the work, and that from then on, Carolina should only share her personal life with the director in charge of her fraternal chat. I found this very disturbing, since I had really become her friend, and it didn't seem normal that now we could no longer be friends. This was also hard for Carolina, who, by the way, was denied the admission as a numerary member after they found out she suffered from asthma. She was admitted as a supernumerary instead. The worst part of it all was that she found out about this on the day she was supposed to do her admission in the work. She was planning on moving to the Center of Studies and had even bought the things required to bring when you move into the center, such as the right number of skirts, shirts, white robes for cleaning, etc. Carolina suffered a great disappointment when they denied her admission as a numerary, and when she called to tell me about it and I listened to her, I was reprimanded for disobeying the directors. They said I shouldn't have listened to her and that was the result of having a bad spirit. From then on, I was forbidden from talking to Carolina. It was not surprising that she was not a supernumerary for very long. She was smart enough to leave before it was too late. Not long after that, I tried to tell the directors that I was having doubts about my vocation, but they always said it was a temptation of the devil. I felt manipulated and started doing things because the directors asked me to, and because I had to obey the directors and live the spirit of the work, even though I didn't believe it in my heart. I felt like I was living a lie, but was afraid to leave because I didn't want to be doomed to hell. They told me that if I said no to my vocation, I would never be happy or be able to live in the grace of God again. There was a point in my life when I prayed to the founder more than I did to God, almost like if the founder was becoming more important to me than God himself, which I think is a big issue. If you are a religious person watching this should kind of be a red flag for you. No human being on this planet is supposed to be elevated above the Creator, above God, above Jesus Christ. And for a Catholic organization to be exemplifying that type of behavior should be a major red flag. Finally, a year after my Center of Studies, the person that I did my fraternal chat with told me that they had seen that I no longer had a vocation for the work. So again, these people are deciding the members, whether or not these members have a vocation or not. They're saying, oh, we see something special in you, you have a vocation, come join us. And then when these people get fed up, no longer want to be a part of the bullshit anymore, they're like, you don't have a vocation, you need to move on. This is just bizarre. I asked them why they had waited almost 5 years to tell me. I never got a good answer. The director from my center at the time said that they wanted me to stay at the center and live my life as a numerary until March 19th, and it was February 23rd. This is where it starts to get really dark. I refused and requested to be able to call my parents and have them pick me up that same day. They wouldn't allow that. When I tried to get out, they hid the house keys. They wouldn't let me use the phone. They even had me take Rohypnol, a very strong antidepressant that makes you very sleepy, saying that it would help me get some rest. I took it not knowing how strong that medicine really was and the fact that it made you so sedated that you couldn't even think straight. So they drugged this girl so that she could not leave. I want you to understand that. Understand what I just read. They drugged her with Rohypnol because she was panicking and wanted to leave. They hid the house keys, would not let her use the phone, drugged her. I still refused to do as they said, so finally that night, CR, a numerary that had lived close to the founder for years, came to my center to tell me that I had received permission from the father to go home the next day. She said that I had never done the work's apostolate, that I always did my own, and if I ever spoke against the work, she herself would make sure that my reputation would be ruined and that the doors of Opus Dei would be forever closed if I spoke negatively against them. It is now 11 years later that I am finally speaking out. This is just a short summary of her experience within Opus Dei as a young person. Absolutely horrifying. Horrifying. As if you don't already have a clear enough picture of how disgusting things are inside this organization. I think we've already gotten a clear enough picture from that, from the letter from the parents in the last story, but I like to do things in threes, so we're going to read one last story. I know this is already getting long, so thanks for sticking with me, but trust me, it is worth it. In her book, Beyond the Threshold, A Life in Opus Dei, Maria del Carmen Tapia says, according to the founder, an auxiliary could never aspire to be more than a good servant. In countries where numeraries and servants perform housekeeping in centers of male members of the prelature, they receive a salary, though a low one, but no social security. On the principle of poverty, these salaries go directly to the coffers of the house where the servants live. The servants do not receive any money. It is supposed that the numeraries who accompany them will pay for whatever purchases are made. Naturally, when they need clothes or shoes, they get them, but they do not handle any money. So, this is her story. I was a member of Opus Dei for 7 years. My status within Opus Dei was called an assistant numerary. My first contact with Opus Dei came through an advertisement for one of their catering colleges in a national newspaper. The advertisement offered young girls certification in household management and cookery. Those interested went through 2 interviews, one in their family home and one in the center of Opus Dei. At that time in my country, there was widespread economic recession and a high rate of unemployment. Potential students were guaranteed full-time, permanent positions at the conclusion of the catering course. This sweetener influenced my parents' decision to place me in this particular school. So at the age of 15, I began my catering course. 4 months later, I was an assistant numerary. I was recruited in the usual way. I was considered a leader by the member of Opus Dei in the center, therefore highly likely to influence other girls. However, I now realize that that was something subversive that made Opus Dei directors single me out from the other students. My family had a particular problem, which I had discussed with my tutor during our so-called tutorials. I did not know until many years later that she had discussed my family's problem with our other directresses, who put into action a sophisticated plan to recruit me. So basically, these tutors were just a method for Opus Dei to gather information about the people that they were bringing into their organization, under the guise of it being tutoring or counseling or whatever. Major breach of trust. They first started suggesting that I pray for my family, then attend weekly confession and daily communion, and so on. They told me that if I followed God's will, then my family's situation at home would improve. Before I knew it, I had a vocation. They told me I would be unhappy for the rest of my life if I did not do what God wanted. Gee, that sounds familiar. In addition, the problem in my family would worsen. I was frightened out of my wits when I whistled in Rome at the UNIV conference as an assistant numerary. When I returned to my country after the UNIV conference, they separated me from the other students in the catering course. They censored my incoming and outgoing mail, monitored my phone calls, and went through my personal belongings. I had to make an accounting of my daily activities to the directresses. I had to hand over what little money I had. What disturbed me most during this time was how the Opus Dei members scrutinized and directed my relationship with my family. They told me what I could write and not write in my letters to them, and what to say to them when I was speaking to them on the phone. There was always a numerary in the vicinity when my family rang, and she always called me aside to question me about the phone call afterwards. Needless to say, my family was totally unaware that I had become a member of Opus Dei. The directresses told me I could tell them once the course was finished. Meanwhile, they told me to lie to them about what was happening in my life while I was on visits and holidays with them. After such visits, the members of Opus Dei interrogated me about where I slept, what we discussed, and what newspapers we read. My family eventually did see a big change in my behavior. My bubbly, outgoing personality disappeared. I became introverted and suspicious of everything. As the course was about to finish, they instructed me to tell my parents about my impending decision to join Opus Dei. My parents learned of my decision and went crazy. My only answer to their barrage of questions was, "It's the will of God," which was what had been spoon-fed her by the organization. My parents very reluctantly let me return to take my exams, hoping I would change my mind. That was not going to happen. Instead, Opus Dei shipped me off to one of their centers with many assistant numeraries and a few numeraries. We assisted in the running of a number of centers of Opus Dei for both males and females. The full realization of my status as an assistant numerary now began to dawn on me. I had never been informed of the role and responsibilities of an assistant numerary. They just told me that assistant numeraries and numeraries were the same, just that our work was different. But I began to realize that my life was going to be one of long working hours, hard work, and absolutely no social life. In addition, it was very clear that we were in no way the same as numeraries. So they're breaking people down into classes and assigning them a sense of worth based on the class that they fall into. First of all, there were material differences between the two classes of members. Numeraries wore expensive clothes, while assistant numeraries wore uniforms with a white apron. Assistant numeraries can only wear ordinary clothes if they leave the center, but they are usually secondhand or inexpensive clothes. Numeraries ate in different dining rooms with better quality foods, whereas we ate the leftovers. This happened in the 21st century, 20th and 21st centuries, guys. This didn't happen a long time ago. I mean, granted, it's probably been going on for a long time, but this is from not that long ago, within our lifetimes. This sounds like something from the Middle Ages. The numeraries were usually waited on by an assistant numerary dressed in a long-sleeved black dress with a starched white collar, cuffs, headdress, and apron. Numeraries had a much higher quality of table linens, bed linens, crockery, and furniture than those used by the assistant numeraries. Our sleeping quarters and bathrooms were also different. Numeraries usually had en-suite facilities, while assistant numeraries had communal bathrooms and bedrooms. In countries where there were large groups of members, like in Spain or in Rome, the two classes even had separate oratories. The numeraries' oratories were lavish and bedecked in gold, whereas those used by the assistant numeraries were plain and wooden. Assistant numeraries also used separate entrances into the centers of Opus Dei called the servants' entrance, which was usually out of sight in the back of the building. While these differences of the two seemingly equal groups may appear to be simply material, there are also very disturbing attitudes which underlie these distinctions, which is unsurprising. The Opus Dei Catechism defines assistant numeraries as follows, quote, "There are other numeraries who do the menial and housekeeping work in Opus Dei houses who are called servants," end quote. While the term servants has been suppressed and the term assistant or auxiliary is now used, the reality continues to exist for many assistant numeraries across the world. Assistant numeraries are usually recruited from rural, poor, and uneducated backgrounds, while numeraries tend to be recruited from educated, wealthy backgrounds. Assistant numeraries can never occupy positions of authority, nor can they work outside Opus Dei houses. Tapia suggests that the founder of Opus Dei saw assistant numeraries as having limited intelligence, or as he called it, quote, "their own mentality." All members of Opus Dei receive education in various forms on annual courses, and so the difference between the type of educations given reflects the attitudes towards each group. Numeraries receive classes in theology, canon law, and Spanish, while assistant numeraries receive classes in basic hygiene, basic reading, and writing, and elementary religious instruction. So they're basically not even treating these people as fully human. They're treating them as subpar members of society, free labor, because even though they get paid, they have to give their salary to the house that they're living in, and they're degraded while they're at it. Escriva also considered assistant numeraries to be devoid of human emotion. What was with this guy, guys? This guy! For example, assistant numeraries are allowed to hold babies, while numeraries are not. Escriva believed that a numerary's maternal instinct might be triggered by holding a baby, but he thought this would not happen to an assistant numerary because he believed she does not possess such an emotion. Ironically, the directors constantly told us that we were the mothers of all members of Opus Dei, and why wouldn't we be? We cooked, cleaned, and ironed morning to night, 7 days a week, 52 weeks of the year in, year out for these numeraries. Escriva liked to call assistant numeraries his little daughters. I would hate to be his daughter. It is well known that he encouraged their childish behavior. Tapia says that she was embarrassed by seeing adult women behaving like 13-year-olds. The directresses also egged us on to indulge in this behavior. After a while, it became a difficult habit to shake off. They're encouraging a childlike, easily impressionable behavior in these women. And why would that be, do you think? Probably because children are so easy to manipulate, so easy to control. It's sad, but it's true. If you want to control someone, a kid is a really easy person to control. And so they encourage this childlike behavior, which becomes a way of life for these people because of this environment that they are constantly living in. There's a degree of helplessness in a child. They are reliant on their caretakers, their guardians, their parents. This thing is It's really bad. Assistant numeraries could never be left alone. Numeraries always had to accompany us wherever we went, inside and outside of the centers. We could not possess or have access to any money. The numeraries had to pay for everything. These attitudes and conditions formed the basis of my life in Opus Dei. My life was controlled and suppressed, and I had little access to the outside world. Our newspapers were censored, and our television was often switched off if it was deemed unsuitable by one of the fanatic numeraries. My claustrophobic life had little room for individuality or creativity. As rural rural girls, we were often on the receiving end of Numeraries' jokes. Since they were predominantly from the cities, they laughed at our accents, our language, and our rural traditions. We were often at the receiving end of their bad tempers, but were not allowed to give them fraternal corrections. The directress would undoubtedly rule in favor of the numerary in question. I lived a life of conformity and indoctrination. I began to ask questions about some of the contradictions that I saw, but was quickly quieted by being told I would go to hell for even thinking about such things. Because of my lack of education, I was unable to articulate a reply. Eventually, I could take no more. I was unable to understand the inconsistencies of my surroundings. I became confused about who God was. It seemed as if Escriva was more revered than God himself. At times, I felt that it was often weeks before I even heard the word God. It was always the Father and our Father. I longed for the God I knew before my life in Opus Dei. One wet, windy morning, I left the center of Opus Dei and my many assistant numerary friends. The numerary who brought me to my point of departure threw my bag on the ground and walked away without even saying goodbye. I was stunned by the behavior of this person who was apparently dedicated to God. Yeah, right. And I say yeah, right about them being dedicated to God. They're being treated like princes and princesses in these centers. It's a very egotistical existence, nothing to do with serving anyone. As I climbed on the transport which brought me to my family, I realized that while I was in Opus Dei, they had even stripped me of the skills to purchase a ticket. I arrived home to my forgiving family, hurt, confused, guilty, and in severe shock. Slowly, I began to realize that the world was not as cruel or evil as what Opus Dei had painted it. Oh my god, there were many good people out there. I don't know why I'm getting emotional. It is just so sad. Nothing makes me more angry than seeing people get taken advantage of and forced to live a fearful existence because they're afraid that if they don't do exactly what they're being told to do, something terrible will happen to them, that they'll suffer eternal damnation. It is unspeakably cruel, and it makes me so angry. And I am so happy that each of these stories, with the exception of the letter, the two people telling these stories got out. I pray to God the parents got their daughters out. I pray to God people continue to get out. I tried to get by for a while by telling myself that everything was fine and that I was able to cope. However, having been stripped of all social skills and self-confidence, I urgently needed counseling. Yeah. After a long period of time, I slowly regained my self-esteem. I returned to school and finished my post-primary education, went to university, and completed a degree. I hope to do a master's degree within the next few years. I now have a good job, car, house, and a good relationship. There are many assistant numeraries across the world living lives quite similar to the one I have explained. I feel that these women's human rights are severely breached by the attitudes and rules of Opus Dei. However, Opus Dei continues to justify and allow this type of status to exist. It can only be described as a serious exploitation of a vulnerable group of women in the name of God. I know of many very unhappy and disturbed women who are still in Opus Dei giving their all for this organization. I personally witnessed self-mutilations by some of these people, and I can still hear their muffled cries at night. Depression and eating disorders were common. Some assistant numeraries who were physically unable to work anymore were expelled without any explanation, money, or any home to go to. Many do not speak out because of their lack of education and the guilt they feel. Many live in fear of the members of Opus Dei and their ability to backlash at those who speak out against them. While many people are aware of the methods of recruitment used by Opus Dei and the types of lives numeraries live, in particular, the lives of assistant numeraries are generally overlooked. I urge you to please consider the circumstances in which these women live. We need to give this silent, vulnerable, forgotten group of women a voice. I have not highlighted the issue of corporal punishment because corporal punishment wasn't a punishment in our lives. We had so many other things worse to contend with. Please ponder on the words of the Bill of Human Rights, Article 7. No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Article 8. No one shall be held in servitude. There are many more issues which I have not discussed. However, I have attempted to give an outline of the lives that assistant numeraries live. Please pray for them. I have a major issue with people subjecting a degree of control over a group of people, an individual, whoever it may be, under the guise of serving God, under the guise of some religion. And I think because human beings can be so terrible and also very opportunistic, that Opus Dei was born in an environment where that kind of thing can thrive. The Catholic Church is a very all-or-nothing religion. And I'm not going to get into my opinions, like I said, because this is not the place for it. But when you have that kind of environment, something like Opus Dei, it's practically just a matter of time. At some point, Later on down the line, I'm going to be talking about Opus Dei's relationship with Rome and some of the interesting, troubling relationships that exist and why I think they exist. I don't think that Rome is innocent in this. This video turned out to be a lot more serious than I thought it was going to be, but this stuff needs to be talked about. These people need to have their experiences highlighted and recognized. So that is where I'm going to leave the video for now. Stay tuned because there's more to come. Thank you for sticking it out this far. I know this was long, but like I said, I think all of this was very, very important. If you have any information about Opus Dei, if you were a member yourself and you're willing to talk about it, please do reach out. You can just email me if you don't want to leave a comment. You can remain anonymous. If you have any information, links, articles, that kind of thing that you would be willing to shoot my way, I'm always looking for stuff like that. There's some out there if you know where to look, not necessarily a ton. Give this video a thumbs up. Please subscribe so that you'll be here for the future videos that come out about this. I appreciate the support and thank you for watching. And I hope that I will see you again for the next video, whenever and wherever that may be. Bye guys.